Hello everyone, my name is Sarafi and I'm happy to meet you all. And today, for my members only content, we're going to talk about hand traps, the history of hand traps, the purpose of hand traps, and what I think hand traps bring to the game and what hand traps are the most efficient in the best situations. Hand traps have existed in Yu-Gi-Oh! Since the very beginning. The first hand trap that was released was Karibo, which is a card that came out, I think, in like Metal Raiders, so literally the second set. During damage calculation, if your opponent's monster attacks as a quick effect, you can discard this card. You take no damage from that battle. Simple, effective, but it created an idea. An idea that during either player's turn, you could send a card from your hand to the graveyard to pay a cost and use an effect. That monsters didn't have to be on the field to be useful. It's a cool idea, and it's been used a lot since. Now, when I say hand trap, I'm not just talking about monster effects. There are monsters that can special summon themselves from the hand during the opponent's turn, like Bestials. There are spell and trap cards that can be activated from the hand during the opponent's turn, like Runic Fountain or Infinite Impermanence. Generally speaking, what I mean when I say a hand trap is an effect that can be used when your opponent is going first and you have taken no actions. So, after Karibo, there were several important hand traps that were released that had sort of a huge impact on their meta. One of these, the most common one, is DD Crow, level 1 Winged Beast. You could discard this card to target one card in your opponent's graveyard and banish it, monster, spell, or trap. You can chain it to the activation of a card that would special summon from the graveyard, that would return a card from the graveyard to the deck, that would add a card from the graveyard to the hand. There were so many ways that DD Crow was useful. It was essentially like a one-time Necro Valley, really. And Necro Valley was a really powerful card, always has been. So DD Crow as like this one-sided, one-time Necro Valley effect was just really, really good for a lot of decks. Another hand trap that came out relatively early and was a huge impact was Gorz the Emissary of Darkness. This is a level 7 Dark Fiend monster with 2700 attack and 2500 defense. When you take damage from a card in your opponent's possession while you control no cards, no monsters, no spells, and no traps, then you can special summon Gorz from your hand. If the damage you took was battle damage, you special summon a level 7 token with attack and defense equal to the damage that you took. This card was so powerful and could cause so much damage on the clapback. You just play Raigeki and then you just swing in for all the damage you took plus 2700, that people would be afraid to actually attack if the opponent had they would be more afraid to attack an opponent who didn't have a trap card than an opponent who did have a trap card. That's how powerful Gorz was for a while. Especially because, when we got to the Synchro era, there were level 7, there were so many good cards that you could use to make, the token you could use as material. It was just, a dangerous time. Then we moved into this kind of idea that hand traps should stop being so focused on battle. Right now, the main hand trap that focuses on battle is a Numeron Wall, and that's primarily because Numeron Wall has other impacts in its own deck. And more focus on going one for one. The idea of a negate as a hand trap is very useful because you would essentially give a card from your hand and you would turn one of your opponent's cards off. And we moved into this sort of idea of the main deck being not so much your beat sticks and your defenders, but rather being materials to summon cards from the extra deck. At that point, the game became too fast and too consistent for you to rely on trap cards as your main method of interaction during your opponent's turn. And trap cards have always been a card type that was really difficult to play because they were so bad going second. Your opponent goes first, they already have a huge advantage. They get to play the game while you have no interaction. And then they also can set trap cards, which will stop you from potentially building a board to fight their board before you've even started. Meanwhile, if you have trap cards, you can only play them on turn 3. After your opponent's already built their board, after most of the cards in their hand have already been used, after you've had to try and do a battle phase against them. So that was good back when games lasted 6 or 7 turns. But now that games are primarily decided on the 3rd or 4th turn, trap cards are far too slow to be useful going second. And since you can't guarantee that you'll go first, it's better to have cards that you can play on either player's turn. Spell cards are also the idea of, potentially a good card for going second, because you can use them to, like cards like Raigeki and Dark Hole, to try and clear your opponent's board. But as more and more cards have been released that search and that special summon from the deck, and the extra deck has become more and more ubiquitous and more bloated, it's become less and less likely that a single board breaker will actually result in the board being broken, especially with so many powerful floating effects that exist in the game, and the ability to negate spell cards. So it was just better for you to play hand traps, and there were some powerful hand traps that were printed, which kind of led people to this conclusion. One such hand trap was Effect Veiler. Effect Veiler is a level 1 light spellcaster tuner monster. During your opponent's main phase, as a quick effect, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard, target one effect monster your opponent controls, and negate its effects until the end of the turn. So there are a lot of drawbacks to this card. It can only be used on your opponent's turn, and only during the main phase. So it can't be used during the battle phase, the draw phase, or the standby phase. It has to target, and it has to target only an effect monster. And it can only target a card your opponent controls. Then you can negate its effects while it's face up until the end of the turn. So that's a lot of drawbacks. And yet, this card was so good primarily because it turned off the entire card. Unlike a card like Ash Blossom Joy Springs, which would negate the activation of a single effect, Effect Veiler made the card completely dead. The main reason that people have stopped playing Effect Veiler as much as they used to is because Infinite Impermanence does the same thing that Effect Veiler does, but Infinite Impermanence can be played when you go second, and it can be played on your turn to try and turn a negate off. So Effect Veiler is, because it can only be played on your opponent's turn, it is less useful, even though it is also a level 1 tuner monster and can be used for synchro summoning, which makes it very, very good. Imperm is simply better. Okay. But Effect Veiler kind of set the stage for this focus on, maybe I don't need to play cards like Compulsory Evacuation Device or Needle Sealing to stop my opponent from playing the game. And then we got a few other powerful tools. One of the main ones being Herald of the Orange Light. This card is actually not nearly as ubiquitous as the other hand traps I'm going to talk about. It's simply much more powerful. Herald of Orange Light is a level 2 light fairy tuner monster. When your opponent activates a monster effect anywhere, as a quick effect, you can descend this card and one other fairy from your hand to the graveyard, negate the activation, and if you do, destroy the monster. So this was a 2-for-1. You had to give up 2 cards from your hand, but it was a negate and a destroy, and it worked anywhere. In the main deck, in the extra deck, graveyard, hand, or field. It destroyed the card, and it would negate an effect. So, and it didn't target. So Herald of the Orange Light, even though it could only be played in fairies were already a deck that really focused on negates, and especially multiple negates, and Herald of Orange Light was just a card that would literally be the nail in the coffin that would make sure you could negate every card on your opponent's field. And this card's still limited 1 in the OCG to this day because of how powerful it is. But as kind of like an explanation of the power of Herald in a more relatable form, we have Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit. Ghost Ogre and Snow Rabbit is a level 3 psychic tuner monster with 0 attack and 1800 defense. When a monster on the field activates its effect, or when a spell or trap card that is already face up on the field activates its effect, as a quick effect, you can send this card from your hand or field to the graveyard to destroy that card on the field. You can only use this effect once per turn. So we get into our first hand trap that can only be used once per turn. Now, Ghost Ogre is an example of a card that really tries to hammer home this idea of a 1-for-1. In most instances, Ghost Ogre is not a negate. It simply destroys a card. but there are a lot of times where destroying a card makes its effect worthless, or outright negates it in the case of a continuous spell or a field spell. But for the most part, if your opponent played a card, like, for example, they played the effect of Gaga Magician, for example. Gaga Magician's effect changes its level. Okay, you don't need to negate that, but if you destroy Gaga Magician, who cares what its level is? It's been destroyed. It can't be used for anything. Similarly, if your opponent activated the effect of Destiny Hero Phoenix, Destroyer Phoenix Enforcer, and they wanted to destroy 2 cards on the board, and then you used Ghost Ogre, well, then your opponent would be destroying, they would destroy one of their own cards to destroy one of your cards, but then their DPE would also be gone. Potentially could stop them from getting lethal, or it could potentially give you lethal. So Ghost Ogre allowed you to exploit effects, especially effects that made your opponent go minus for cost. Ghost Ogre would make them go even more minus. So it was a card that was designed primarily to keep things even without negating. And it is a card that I think is still very good. It's just that a lot of people, a lot of cards these days are good enough, even if they've been destroyed, to continue to see play. So Ghost Ogre doesn't have a lot of targets that really feel good to shut down with at the moment. One of the most ubiquitous hand traps in the game is Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. This is a level 3 fire zombie tuner monster. When a card or effect is activated that includes one of these effects, as a quick effect, you can discard this card and negate that effect. Add a card from your from your deck to the hand, special summon from the deck, send a card from the deck to the graveyard. You can only use this effect once per turn. So, Ash Blossom is an example of a card that a lot of people slept on for a while. Ash Blossom was released, and people assumed that she was, because she was only could stop one card from being drawn, that she was less efficient than Droll and Lockbird. And so people slept on Ash for a format or two. And the main reason that Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring started seeing play is because of Zodiacs. Zodiacs had a card in their deck that allowed them to special summon directly from the deck, which was something that Droll couldn't stop, but Ash could. And even though it was only one effect, that change was so huge because the Trident player had to go minus to use the effect that people started to see the value of Ash, and they would put Ash in their side deck, specifically to counter Zodiacs. And then, like, if they ended up leaving it in their deck for another match, they would see, Ash actually has more targets than I thought, and maybe you can use Ash in combination with Droll. And so Ash started to see more and more play, and of course in Master Duel and in the OCG, Ash's primary function is to stop Max C. So this card is, honestly, Ash is probably one of the examples of a hand trap that I think is the least well designed, primarily because what's happened now is that Konami is releasing a lot of cards that set cards from the deck. Cards like, for example, Phantom of You, Spirit of Yubel. Spirit of Yubel can set Nightmare Pain directly from your deck rather than adding it to your hand, so that it can't be ashed and so that it can play around Droll and Lockbird. So when these cards that stop you from drawing are so common and see play so much, Konami, if they want you to buy their new cards, will simply have to print cards that get around that. Okay, well, then these cards become a crutch, essentially. They are, they're holding all the old cards from the 25-year deck format back, and then all the new cards are being printed that get around them. And that becomes a dam. Now you have to wait until the Ash becomes not good enough for all the new cards. But when you stop playing the Ash, the dam breaks, and all the old cards that Ash was keeping in check come flooding back into the game. And this is a problem that is unique to Yu-Gi-Oh! Every other game has their own formats. They have rotations. You don't have to worry about 20-year-old cards. Like, for example, Trident Dragion. Trident Dragion was printed ages ago. It was bad when it was printed. No one's thought about it in 6 years. And then, all of a sudden, Tenpai comes out. Now Fire Dragon Synchro has support, and Trident Dragion is like a $200 card. That's insane. How are you supposed to do this? If you can play literally any card that's been printed in the 200 sets since Yu-Gi-Oh came out, in any deck, then you can't possibly think of all the synergies that could potentially be included when you print new cards. It's gotten to the point where Konami has to be super specific when they print cards, like that new Jurassic Power card that lets you search specifically a dinosaur with 1,200 defense points, so that they can control exactly which cards get added to that pool. That's just how things are at this point. That you just have to, that Konami has to be ridiculous with the way that it prints cards, because they allow for any card to be used. But that also means that we as players can't really predict anything. We just have to see cards, when they get printed, we have to see what synergies they'll have after people actually playtest. And when you can't possibly predict what cards are going to be used, you just feel powerless. And so you have to use all the most extreme hand traps in the game. And that's why Max C exists. Max C, which is the most infamous and most powerful hand trap in the game, exists primarily because at this point there are too many one-card starters that allow you to just extend and extend and extend forever. And there are too many decks that don't have a hard lock that allow you to play, like, maybe their lock is like the same type or the same attribute, and then you just say, okay, I can play Black Wings, I can only play Dark Monsters, I can play Raid Raptors, I can play DDD, I can play Time Thieves. This is real. This is not me like making things up. That's what Black Wings can do. Black Wings can literally play all of those, and they do play all of those cards to make this stupid long combo where they end on, I don't know, Triple D King Calamity or whatever his name is, and then they don't do that so much anymore now that they got support. But that was a problem for a while when you played against Black Wings, was that you had to deal with all this different trash from different decks. And you might say that's cool, but in reality, it's just too difficult for anyone to predict what sort of combo, what sort of end board people will be playing, because you're not locked into your archetype. You're not locked into like a type. You're not locked into an attribute for the most part in a lot of decks. And there's simply too much extension in the game. There's simply too much search. There's simply too much draw. Extra deck monsters are simply too ubiquitous. It's simply too easy to make Xyz and Link monsters all the time. So Max C, Molcharmy, Nibiru the Primal Being, and Ghost Mourner and Spooky Dogwood are all cards that exist to punish the ridiculous extension that exists in the game. And to be fair, Max C does it very well, because when you activate Max C, a lot of times your opponent's just going to stop their turn, and they should, because if you summon, like if you're gonna end on 4 powerful monsters, right? Well, then that means that you probably use two materials per card, which means you're going to summon 8 times and then 4 more times. So that means that you're potentially getting 4 powerful pieces of interaction, but under Max C, you're giving your opponent 12 draws. Are you going to be able to stop 12 draws and the opponent's normal cards per turn with only 4 cards on the field? Probably not. And that is why Molcharmy, has that like restriction of it's based on the number of monsters the opponent ends on. That's the number of cards you get to keep. But Max C still exists. Like, even though it's been banned in TCG, it still exists. And I do think that Max C represents a necessary evil, because it's simply too difficult for people to play around every single option, every single card that exists in the game, every single deck, every single strategy. You just can't. And there's no mana. There's not really a hand size limit. Like, you can literally go through 12 or 15 cards in your first turn, just by playing the game. So, since there's no limit on the number of cards that you can play in one turn, you can have 12 to 15 minute turns turn 1, and it's just overwhelming for the player going second. So, they can either print more and more powerful board breakers, or they can allow hand traps to stop people from flooding the board. And you might argue that Max C is the wrong way to go about that. I don't think Nibiru the Primal Being is good enough. This card allows you to remove every monster on your opponent's side of the field from the board, but once you've activated the effect, they can keep summoning. So The problem with Nibiru is that if you wait too long, your opponent will have a monster negate that can simply stop the Nibiru from going off. But if you don't wait long enough, your opponent may still have extension and resources that they can continue to play the game with, even after you Nibiru. So Max C, Droll and Lockbird, and Ghost Mourner are just, in my opinion, better tools to punish these long extending games, because Nibiru is such a... it's a card that's so extreme. It's very powerful, of course, but it's either completely worthless if you wait too long, or it doesn't do enough if you fire it off too soon. And there are a lot of ways to stop this card. So Nibiru is a card that will always see play, and it will definitely win games. But I feel like the number of games that Nibiru wins is less than the number of games that it doesn't win. And I think that makes it one of the weaker hand traps, to be honest. But Droll is its own beast. Droll and Lockbird is a level 1 wind spellcaster. If a card is added from the main deck to your opponent's hand except during the draw phase, as a quick effect, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard. For the rest of the turn, cards cannot be added from either player's main deck to the hand. That is such an extreme card because it stops your opponent from doing any search at all. No drawing, no adding to hand, nothing like that. I did mention that a lot of cards are being changed so that they can be set directly from the deck, so that they can get around Droll, but still, Droll is a card that stops a lot of decks in their tracks. And primarily the cost of that is that you have to actually allow your opponent to draw a card first. But I would say that Droll and Lockbird is probably like the second best hand trap in the game. I think it's probably Maxi, Droll, Ash, and then D-Shifter, and then Imperm. That's probably the top 5. And Droll is just... it's so hard to evaluate as a card because some decks can search it. It's searchable with Win the Wind Channeler, which makes it really good. But and the ways that Droll works are so weird. I was playing a game of Chimera yesterday or a couple days ago, and I fusion summoned Guardian Chimera under Droll and Lockbird, and I couldn't actually destroy any cards because Guardian Chimera's effect has you draw cards. So since I couldn't draw any cards, its destroy effect didn't go off, even though Droll didn't actually negate anything, which is really an interesting. It's interesting how the cards are worded to where you have to resolve certain effects to do other effects, and Droll can stop that. But I don't think I think that Droll is good enough to stop a lot of decks, but I don't know that. The main problem with Droll is that so many people can special summon directly from the deck down. That Droll is simply... it answers a problem, but it only answers a problem for some decks, not every deck. And then the last card that I want to talk about is Dimensional Shifter, which is... Dimension Shifter is, if you have no cards in your graveyard, as a quick effect, you can send this card from your hand to the graveyard. Until the end of the next turn, any card sent to the graveyard is banished instead. Dimension Shifter is very, very unique. This card is very powerful. Macrocosmos is a good card. Macrocosmos has saw a lot of play. And this is a Macrocosmos that you can trap your opponent under even if they go first. Which, that was the main problem with Macrocosmos, was that it's a trap card. One of the things that makes Dimension Shifter so interesting is that it stops other hand traps. So for Herald of Orange Light, for Effect Veiler, for Max C, they aren't discarded. They are sent from the hand to the graveyard. So if you can't send a card from the hand to the graveyard, you can't activate it. So Dimension Shifter has both this impact of being ridiculously punishing to a lot of decks that need to revive materials from the graveyard to extend, to also like shutting off other hand traps, which makes it much easier for you to actually play the game, whether you were going first or going second. And in that way, Dimension Shifter is actually very interesting as a way to, if you can play under it, if you can play under Dimension Shifter, is a very interesting card to open with, going first to stop other hand traps. And that's why Fluandereeze does so well, because Fluandereeze can play Dimension Shifter. It doesn't hurt them in any way, and it allows them to basically turn off your opponent's hand traps so they can play the game really effectively. Now, Ash Blossom and Joyous Springs does go under Dimension Shifter, which is why it's one of the better hand traps in the game. Dimension Shifter is another card that's like, it's very similar to Max C and Droll and Lockbird in that it is an effect that lasts for the whole turn. So nothing your opponent does, they can't play around the Dimension Shifter. They can't like bait the Dimension Shifter. They can't get through it like they can for Ash, like they can for Nibiru. Once D Shifter is on, D Shifter is on. You either end your turn or you play through it. And a lot of decks can't play through a Macrocosmos. It's just too disruptive. So Dimension Shifter is a card that's semi-limited in the OCG. It is a card that really defines like which decks are good and which decks are. And a lot of people have said that the main reason they're excited about Malice is that it's a Cybers deck that can play Dimension Shifter, because Malice likes getting banished. And that might be where we're going, to be honest. It might be that they make more decks that are just basically like this archetype, but it can play under Shifter. Because Shifter is such a meta-warping card. And that's weird. Like you have all these cards being printed that can get around Droll and Ash, but then you also have decks being printed that can play with Dimension Shifter. So it's kind of like Konami is trying to push certain hand traps out of the meta and bring other hand traps more into the meta, which is interesting. And that's why I really wanted to make this video, so that you guys could understand how these cards, the existence and the prevalence of these cards, warps the game around them. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments below. My name is Srafi, and I was thrilled to have all of you with me.